One of the most dramatic shifts in the past 30 years is about to happen in Canada with a $70 billion plan that seeks to transform the country. But one of Canada's big banks has warned that this transformation may not be all it's cracked up to be. Meanwhile, the most powerful Canadian bank of them all, the Bank of Canada, Canada's central bank, which is supposed to be independent of the government, well, they point out a critical flaw that could see Canadians' wages stagnate for the foreseeable future, impacting every single Canadian and their money. And what is this $70 billion plan? Well, it's a part of the Canadian government's budget that is about to be introduced. Now, to be clear, this $70 billion is just the deficit portion. In other words, the amount of spending that is happening that can't be covered by the taxes and revenue that the government collects yearly. The largest chunk of this spending is going towards the Canadian military and the creation of a transformed military-industrial capability that the government believes will grow Canada's economy and create new jobs. A lot of this is going towards the government-selected nation-building projects as well, these infrastructure projects that the government thinks will grow the Canadian economy and make us more interconnected. Now, this is spending and investment in the Canadian economy like we haven't seen in decades, and the government's idea is that if we throw all of this money and all this investment in these different sectors, well, perhaps we can increase the Canadian economy, grow Canadian jobs, and create new industries because now these industries can look towards the government to be their best customer. But in a recent speech, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada outlined a major risk to this strategy. You might remember last year when she said that Canada was in a break the glass in case of emergency type of situation when it comes to our productivity. Now, while the Canadian economy has grown consistently over the past years, it hasn't grown on a per-person basis. We've only grown our economy by increasing the number of people who are working inside of it, not by making it so that each existing person is contributing and, as a result, earning more. If the economy is a pie, well, we've grown the total pie, but each average slice for each person who's inside of the country, well, that's gotten smaller. And that is exactly what led this Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada to say we're in an emergency. Now, recently, about a year after that initial emergency speech, she's now talking about how we haven't made much progress and gives one major reason why.
So I'm going to start today's speech back at another breakfast speech I gave last March in Halifax, and it was on Canada's urgent need to improve productivity. Canadians are still grappling with a higher cost of living. Inflation's been back to the bank's target for about a year and a half, but life is more expensive than it was. And this is frustrating for everyone, and it's particularly stressful for people in lower income brackets and for young Canadians who are trying to get a start in life. I want to illustrate this challenge by diving a bit deeper into one policy area that is critical to an economy's productivity, and that's competition.
So not only does she say that improving our productivity is one of the key ways to really help affordability, increase wages, and boost quality of life, but also she lays out how competition is a critical element to kickstarting this improvement. But some experts believe that this diagnosis and prescription is at odds with the path and the road that Canada is choosing to go down in terms of this new $70 billion spending plan. And it's not just one central bank official. A recent report from one of Canada's largest financial providers lays out similar concerns. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about and lay out why I'm personally afraid that the path we're going down could expand the existing gap between the wealthy and those who are struggling, and how history could, unfortunately, repeat itself. But before we get into that, I wanted to highlight today's sponsor, and that's Dolly Varden Silver, who believes that the silver market is one of the best places to be right now. Donald Trump's push for American resource independence is reigniting a decades-old battle for control over critical minerals against countries like China and Russia. Meanwhile, silver prices are sitting near multi-decade highs driven by a shortage that the Silver Institute expects to continue into 2026. Dolly Varden's flagship asset is the Kitsault Valley project, located in BC's Golden Triangle, which is an area responsible for over 1.2 billion ounces of silver in the last 3 decades. That's worth roughly $68 billion. This area is one of the best mining jurisdictions in the world, and their project includes 5 past producing mines. And they just ended their drill program, and results are still pending, but early signs show that they could be very high grade. On top of their assets, their management grew the company from a $20 million to a $520 million market cap, and that wasn't in a bull market. Now, under the same management, silver's at an all-time high, and they are in a great position to capitalize. For anyone following the broader silver story, particularly as supply tightens and industrial demand accelerates, well, Dolly Varden Silver is a company you should keep your eye on. The ticker is DV on the TSX Venture Exchange and DVS on the NYSE American. You can visit the link down below to learn more about the company and invest through Orbiton, securely integrated with all major brokerages. And to be clear, this is a paid promotion on behalf of Dolly Varden Silver. It's not financial advice or an indication of my personal investments. Now, thanks again to Dolly Varden Silver for sponsoring the channel. We've already talked about how this unprecedented new plan for Canada, in which the government is planning to vastly expand its industrial policy, well, we've talked about how that's largely going towards military spending and nation-building projects and other projects in which the government will choose the specific sectors that get this additional funding. The move is to massively invest in an effort to get things done. But some worry that this strategy goes against the spirit of competition, this solution that Canada's central banker is laying out as one of the only ways to make things better for average Canadians. This recent report from Desjardins about this new plan outlines how some of this infrastructure spending, these nation-building projects under the Building Canada Act, how it's not entirely clear on why the people who are getting the funding and why the people who aren't getting the funding aren't getting the funding. They talk about how the criteria used to select these major projects remains vague and lacks the transparency that would help better understand why some projects are selected over others. And Global News has outlined it as well with this article titled, "What is National Interest? Major Projects Law Still Hasn't Defined It." The government has made clear that they don't currently have a definition on what is the national interest and how they are defining what projects will be selected in the national interest. One of the key elements of this Building Canada Act is that the selected projects are able to skirt past regulations that other players that haven't been selected by the government still have to play by. This puts different players in different industries on different playing fields, dependent on if they receive government support. Now, even if these different companies are on different playing fields, could these investments grow the economy? Well, absolutely they could. Could these investments create tens of thousands of new jobs for Canadians? Yes, they definitely could. It could spur job growth. It could help build infrastructure more quickly. These are good things. But does it help to build a system that's self-sufficient? Or does it make it a system that's more reliant on government help? Does it force businesses to innovate? Or does it force businesses to write grants and proposals that convince the government that they will one day in the future innovate, while those results aren't actually guaranteed? Does this limit our competitive environment? Does it stop businesses from competing and innovating these key things that could help Canadians' productivity levels? This could all be worth the risk of spending if it actually can catalyze growth and bring in more outside private investment. But I'm skeptical that this will happen. And if it doesn't, I think that we make the system even more reliant on this type of spending. Now, you might be asking, well, Russell, why is this a bad thing? If the economy is growing and jobs are created and infrastructure gets built, well, then why should we be even worried if the government has to spend huge amounts of money to make this happen? I'm not seeing changes in terms of my the financial situation. So if the government spends, well, isn't it worth it if we get things done? Now, in my personal worldview, this all comes down to one concept that I think has caused the most harm for average people, and it's upstream from the biggest issues of our day: the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the trend of lower family formation, fewer people having children and waiting longer to have those children, resulting in declining birth rates, and then the patching of that hole with dramatic immigration policy, the ensuing suppression of wages for average Canadians that comes from that. Now, all of these things, they're all directly related to this one concept, and that's monetary expansionism. Now stay with me here. You might hear that term monetary expansionism and your eyes may glaze over, but I promise it's super easy to understand, and once you do, everything else will make a lot of sense. Now, if you've watched the channel for a while, you'll have no doubt heard parts of this. I've talked about it a lot, but let's look at it from a different angle. When I talk about monetary expansionism, I'm just talking about the money in Canada, the total amount of it, and that total amount of dollars in the system expanding, monetary expansionism. I think it's best to explain this by looking at the most recent time that this happened in Canada, which was during the pandemic. This didn't just happen in Canada, but it did happen in Canada in a big way. If you remember back to 2020, governments around the world were saying that they needed to spend huge amounts of money to prop up the economy while they closed it down. But they recognized that there would not be enough demand in the bond market for them to borrow this money. So central banks, most notably the Federal Reserve in the States and here in Canada, the Bank of Canada, well, they printed hundreds of billions of new dollars, which flooded into the system, admittedly, which helped to sustain this massive growth in government debt. Now, there were 100% many positives that came from this. It limited economic scarring from the pandemic. It reduced the very human harm that could have come if people were forced not to work and were simultaneously not given any kind of support from the government. I just think that there's just as bad, if not worse, human consequence for doing this. This caused a lot of good, but the downstream consequences, I question if that the bad is outweighing the good that happened on the front end. This flooding of new dollars into the system, well, it largely drove up prices of things. We saw the price of goods and services that average Canadians interact with on a daily basis, well, they all went up. But about a year before that, we saw something even earlier, which was asset inflation, asset price inflation. We saw the cost of housing grow substantially. Stocks went up. All of these ownership assets, well, they went up in value, which led to the expansion of the wealth gap, one of the biggest concerns I have about Canada. People who were in a good enough position to own real estate, to own stocks, to own real assets, well, all of those values went up incredibly, at least in dollar terms, while on the flip side, what each individual dollar can buy you, well, that diminished greatly. A dollar doesn't go as far today as it did 10 years ago. This is the cost of living crisis. This is the housing crisis. And as a result of those two things, we have an even larger demographic crisis in Canada, with fewer families forming, in my opinion, largely because of the cost of living. When you can't have stability in terms of your housing, when you don't have stability in terms of your financial future, then I think a lot of far fewer people are going to make the decision to start a family, to have children, and to grow the Canadian population via this family formation. I think that that's one of the big problems we face today. And then the government subsequently sees that our population is shrinking and sees that our economy can't continue growing because we have low productivity, so we need to add more workers to that economy. But when we're having fewer people born, it's pretty hard to add workers to the economy unless you patch that hole via mass immigration, something the government went forward with, making it even less likely to see productivity and wage growth because no longer do businesses have to compete for labor. There's a supply glut of it. You might be thinking, okay, Russell, you're getting kind of off track here. How does this all relate to Canada's new plan? Well, we previously asked, well, if the economy grows and jobs are created and infrastructure gets built, and all it takes is the government just increasing its spending to do all of this, then isn't it worth it? After all, you've got to spend money to get things done. Well, here's how it relates. In Carney's recent pre-budget address to the nation, he laid out how now is the time to take these risks and to invest this amount of money. He believes that this is the right path forward.
We used to build things in this country. We can build again. We used to explore this country. We can chart new courses again. We used to take big, bold risks in this country. It is time to swing for the fences again.
But you have to admit, when you swing for the fences, there's a chance that you strike out. And with any investment, there's the chance that it pays off, yes, and then there's also the chance that it doesn't return what you would expect. And the unique thing about this plan is that the government is borrowing money to make these investments. This isn't money spent that they currently have. They're taking on dramatic amounts of debt in order to actually execute these plans. And if it's all managed efficiently and everything gets built that they say will get built, and if they truly create all these jobs, then this is fantastic. But if it doesn't, And even if it does to some extent, I worry about how piling on more deficit spending could make matters worse if we find ourselves in another situation where there aren't enough buyers for the government's debt. We already went over what happened during the pandemic where the government needed to borrow money to spend to prop up the economy, but there weren't any lenders there for them. Well, what happens when down the road, sometime in the future, another similar situation like this happens? We saw it in the States with the '08 financial crisis. We saw it in Canada with the pandemic. I think it's not unreasonable to worry this might happen again. Now, if we've added on all of this additional government debt, does that make us more or less likely to need to turn to central banks and monetary expansionism to fund that debt growth? And when we do, what does that mean for average people who don't have mass exposure to ownership, don't own real estate, don't own companies, don't own stocks, don't own precious metals, don't own the types of things that go up in value when you reduce the value of a currency? Now, all these things grow in value in dollar terms when monetary expansion happens, but I worry about a further divide of the haves and the have-nots. And in an interesting kind of way, the government actually stands to benefit when this type of thing happens, when there's monetary expansionism, because in real terms, the value of the debt that they've taken on is reduced. If you're someone who's in a huge amount of debt, and then all of a sudden more dollars flood the system, well, the actual value of each of those dollars of debt that you've taken on, well, that is also reduced. If you're a saver and you have dollars in your bank account, well, that is a bad thing. But if you are in debt, then the value of your debt shrinks in terms of real value. I don't know. Am I being a little bit overkill on this point? I mean, let me know. I just wish that these risks and realities were better explained. This mass industrial policy plan could work, but it risks not only the debt problem we were just talking about, but it risks stifling that competition by increasing the amount of winner selection that's done by the government. Now, this, in my eyes, goes against what the central bank deputy governor just said about competition being one of the key ways out of this current financial hardship that average Canadians are feeling the most. And they're experiencing it right now. You feel it, I feel it, everyone feels it. And if we can only grow the economy through massive government spending, well, does that economic growth outweigh the risk of triggering future monetary expansion, wealth gap growth, and cost of living increases? I'm personally not so sure, but I guess we'll have to wait and see because we can't individually control any of this. But let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what I've gotten right, what I've gotten wrong. If I've missed anything entirely, I'm just trying to figure all of this out like any of you are. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. More videos coming out like this. It doesn't cost you a dime to subscribe, but it helps me out dramatically. And with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.